They drilled into my 150-year-old oak trees at night, thinking no one would notice. By morning, the bark was still damp, and the HOA had already posted a violation on my door. I've lived on this property for 12 years. The house sits slightly elevated at the edge of the subdivision, where the original farmland once began. 4 massive live oaks line the back fence, trunks so wide it takes 3 adults to wrap around them. They were here long before the neighborhood was built, long before the HOA existed. The first sign something was wrong came at sunrise. I stepped outside with coffee and noticed pale streaks running down the bark of the 2 oldest trees. The ground beneath them was darker than usual, damp, almost oily. I crouched down and pressed my fingers into the soil. It smelled sharp, chemical. I circled the trunk slowly. Small, evenly spaced drill holes wrapped around the base, each plugged with a bright green cap. Fresh wood shavings still clung to the bark creases. When I touched one of the caps, liquid seeped out around it. This wasn't disease, it was application. I pulled out my phone and began recording. Wide shot of the trunk, close-up of the drill marks, slow pan across the damp soil. I zoomed in on one of the caps and read the stamped code etched along its side. Then I filmed the tire impressions pressed into the grass, dual-axle tread patterns leading from the service road to my rear fence line. 2 days earlier, the HOA had sent me another compliance letter. Trees negatively impact neighborhood harmony. Root systems pose potential infrastructure risk. Removal recommended within 14 days. I had responded the same way I always did, requesting an independent arborist evaluation. These trees had survived storms, droughts, and decades of farming before asphalt ever touched this land. They weren't dying, they were thriving. Now 2 of them were weeping chemicals. That afternoon, I climbed the small slope behind my yard where the fence backs up to the HOA-maintained greenbelt. From there, you can see the irrigation canal that runs along the property line, an old concrete channel with slow-moving water, partially covered by metal grates. It feeds the decorative pond and common lawn beyond. I followed the tire tracks visually. They didn't stop at my fence. They curved back toward the greenbelt service gate. I walked down and inspected the gravel near the gate entrance. Fresh compression marks, mud displaced onto the asphalt. Someone had driven heavy landscaping equipment through after midnight dew had settled, which meant it happened recently. That evening, as if on cue, a second notice appeared on my door. Emergency landscape concern. 2 trees showing decline. Failure to maintain living vegetation subject to daily fine of $250. They had already declared them dying. I stood on my porch holding the paper while watching one of the affected oaks. A faint yellowing had begun at the edge of the canopy, subtle but new. Leaves that had been deep green days ago now looked dusted. The timing was too precise. The next morning, I acted. I purchased sterile core sampling tools from a forestry supplier an hour away. Back home, I filmed myself extracting 2 small wood core samples from below the drill line. Clean insertion, labeled tubes, timestamp visible on camera. Then I scraped soil from 3 locations around the trunk and sealed each bag. After that, I did something else. I installed 2 motion-activated trail cameras, one angled at the tree line, another positioned low near the ground to capture tire movement. I mounted them discreetly inside birdhouse casings attached to fence posts. Before sunset, I climbed a ladder and photographed the full canopy from above my roofline, wide angles to document current leaf density. By day 3, the change was undeniable. Leaves were browning unevenly along the lower branches. Sap flow appeared discolored near the drill points. One of the green plugs had loosened and fallen out completely, leaving a wet cavity in the bark. I filmed everything. Meanwhile, the HOA escalated.
A certified envelope arrived stating that if the trees were confirmed dead or hazardous, the association reserved the right to contract removal and bill the expense to my property account. They weren't just accusing me of neglect, they were preparing to remove 150-year-old oaks. On the fourth night, the trail camera activated at 2:17 a.m. The footage showed headlights cutting across the greenbelt, a landscaping truck backed toward the service gate, two figures exited carrying cylindrical tanks and handheld injectors. The timestamp glowed clearly in the corner of the frame. They approached the tree line from the outside. I watched the clip 3 times. The next morning, I walked the perimeter again. New drill holes, fresh caps, damp soil darkening around the base. They weren't treating disease, they were accelerating decline, and the HOA had already positioned themselves to blame me for it. As I stood there, looking up at the thinning canopy against the morning sky, a realization settled in. If they succeeded in killing these trees, they would classify them as hazards and remove them legally. And once removed, no evidence would remain, unless I moved first. The fines were set to begin in 6 days. The leaves were already turning. The question wasn't whether they intended to force removal, it was whether I could prove what they had done before the trees deteriorated beyond recovery. What they didn't know yet was that these trees weren't just landscaping. They were connected to something older than the subdivision itself, and that connection was documented. But would it be enough to stop what they started?
They thought the trees were just decorative landscaping. They didn't realize they were tied to the oldest infrastructure in the entire subdivision. The morning after reviewing the trail camera footage, I drove straight to the county records office. Not for complaint forms, not for letters, for maps. The original property had been agricultural land until the late 1980s. Irrigation canals ran through it long before homes were plotted. I requested archived plat maps from 1924 through 1952, the era when the oak grove was first documented as boundary shade trees for crop rotation. When the clerk unrolled the microfilm scans onto the viewing table, I saw it immediately. A bold blue line labeled Agricultural Irrigation Easement, recorded 1926, cut directly across what is now my backyard and into the present-day HOA greenbelt. I requested certified copies. Back home, I did something physical, something visible. I walked the entire path of the old irrigation route with a measuring wheel, filming as I went. I traced the concrete canal edge. I recorded the junction where the channel narrows and flows beneath the metal grates into the decorative pond. Then I located the control structure. At the far end of my property, partially hidden by brush, sits a rusted vertical gate valve, the original flow regulator. I'd always assumed it was abandoned, but the county map showed something important. The recorded easement granted the landowner, not the HOA, operational control for maintenance and water diversion rights tied to agricultural preservation language. I brushed dirt off the cast iron wheel and filmed the manufacturer's stamp, 1919. Then I turned it slightly. The water in the canal shifted tone, subtle but visible, slowing as the internal plate adjusted. I didn't shut it, I simply confirmed it worked. Later that afternoon, I walked into the greenbelt and observed the sprinkler heads running across the HOA's manicured lawn. The pond fountain was active, spraying a steady arc into the air. Children were feeding ducks near the shoreline, all of it fed by the same channel. Back at home, I reviewed the new footage from the tree cameras. The landscapers had returned again the previous night, this time carrying a larger tank. I paused the frame and zoomed in on the truck door, a company logo. I searched the state contractor registry and found their licensing category: ornamental pest control and vegetation management. No agricultural chemical permit, no arborist license. I printed the licensing summary. The next escalation came from the HOA.
A bright orange tag was stapled to one of my oak trunks. Pre-removal assessment scheduled. They hadn't even waited for the trees to fully decline. Within 48 hours, 2 workers arrived during daylight with a lift truck and began measuring trunk diameter. I stepped outside with my phone recording openly. They circled the base, tapped the bark with a mallet, photographed the yellowing leaves. I asked calmly, who authorized the injection treatment? They said they were only there to assess removal. As they loaded equipment back into the truck, I walked to the canal again. This time, I brought a GoPro and mounted it beneath the metal grate, filming water flow entering the HOA pond. I recorded the sound, steady movement, consistent depth. Then I returned to the valve and adjusted it slightly again. Not enough to disrupt, just enough to demonstrate control. The water level downstream responded within minutes. Proof of operational linkage.
That evening, I scheduled certified lab analysis for the wood core samples and soil bags. Overnight shipping, chain of custody documentation included. The HOA escalated once more. An email blast went out to residents claiming unsafe tree conditions on my lot posed potential risk to shared water lines and greenbelt irrigation. They were building narrative groundwork, but they made a mistake. In that same message, they attached a map of the greenbelt irrigation layout, a simplified diagram showing water flow from community canal intake. I overlaid their diagram with my certified county easement map. The intake they claimed as community property sat squarely within the recorded 1926 easement corridor, the corridor that ran across my deed. The next morning, one of the affected oaks dropped a cluster of brittle leaves all at once. They scattered across the grass in a dry wave. I filmed them hitting the ground. Then I zoomed in on the bark. New chemical staining had darkened the drill points. Sap was leaking irregularly. I carefully removed one loose green cap using gloves and sealed it inside an evidence bag. The interior smelled strongly of herbicide. I replaced nothing. I simply documented. By late afternoon, lab confirmation arrived via preliminary call. Synthetic growth inhibitor compounds detected in the wood tissue. Concentration levels inconsistent with natural treatment protocols for mature oaks. It wasn't disease control, it was suppression. That evening, as sprinkler heads across the greenbelt rotated in synchronized arcs, I stood at the canal again and placed a measuring stick into the water. Flow depth, 14 inches. I turned the valve wheel 2 rotations counterclockwise. Flow depth, 9 inches. The sprinklers beyond the fence sputtered within minutes, not failing, just losing pressure. I restored it immediately. Documented. The HOA thought they had leverage with fines and removal scheduling, but their landscaping, their pond, their visual curb appeal all depended on a channel governed by an easement older than their bylaws. And if chemical contamination was introduced into vegetation tied to regulated irrigation infrastructure, that wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. The pre-removal crew was scheduled to return in 5 days. The trees were visibly declining. The lab report was pending formal certification. If I moved too soon, they'd accelerate removal. If I waited too long, the trees might not survive. So the question became, when do you reveal leverage, before the cut or at the moment the chainsaws arrive? They scheduled the removal for Friday at 8 a.m., and by Thursday evening, yellow caution tape was already tied around my oaks. I didn't argue, I didn't call the board, I didn't send emails. I documented. At sunrise on Thursday, I set up 2 tripods in my yard, one aimed wide at the entire tree line, the other focused tightly on the base of the 2 affected trunks. I mounted time-lapse cameras high in the branches using a ladder and safety harness. Every leaf shift, every sap drip, every shadow would be recorded. Then I walked the canal again. This time, I brought a clear sampling jar attached to a telescoping pole. I lowered it into the moving water just upstream from my property line and filled it carefully. The current shimmered in the early light, carrying faint sediment from the greenbelt runoff. I sealed the jar, labeled it with time and GPS coordinates, and placed it in a cooler. Next, I walked downstream to where the canal empties beneath the HOA's pond intake. I filled a second jar there. Same process, same documentation. If chemicals had been injected into trees tied to a regulated irrigation easement, runoff contamination was not a hypothetical risk. It was measurable. By mid-morning, a flatbed truck rolled into the Greenbelt service road. The same landscaping company logo was printed on the door. Workers began unloading orange cones and a wood chipper, positioning them just outside my rear fence. They weren't waiting for full canopy failure. They were preparing. I walked to the fence line with my phone recording. "Are you here for injection treatment or removal?" I asked. "Removal assessment," one replied, not meeting my eyes. They placed spray paint marks near the base of the trunks, bright neon X's against centuries-old bark. That was escalation 3. Back inside, I received the final certified lab report via overnight courier. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. The analysis confirmed concentrated levels of synthetic plant growth regulator, a compound typically used for suppression in invasive species management, not appropriate for mature heritage oaks. It also confirmed soil contamination within a 3-foot radius of the drill sites. I scanned every page. Then I did something deliberate. I printed enlarged copies of the 1926 irrigation easement map and laid them across my dining table. I placed transparent overlays of the HOA's greenbelt irrigation diagram on top. I filmed the alignment, the canal intake clearly inside the recorded corridor. I zoomed in on the clause, "Landowner retains operational access and control for maintenance and water diversion within designated channel." Operational access, control. That afternoon, I visited the State Water Authority office. Instead of filing a complaint verbally, I requested a formal contamination review under agricultural water protection guidelines. I handed over the certified lab analysis.
By late afternoon, I returned home. The workers had finished marking equipment placement areas. The wood chipper remained parked just outside the gate. A laminated notice had been zip-tied to my fence. Tree removal scheduled. Safety hazard. The sun was setting through thinning leaves. I walked to the valve one more time, camera rolling. This time, I rotated the wheel fully closed. The sound of moving water diminished to a low echo inside the canal. Within 15 minutes, I could see the effect. The HOA's greenbelt sprinklers activated on schedule, but instead of full-pressure arcs, they sputtered and misted weakly. The pond fountain sputtered twice before cutting off entirely. Residents walking dogs paused to look. I waited 10 minutes. Then I reopened the valve to its original position. Water surged back through the channel. The fountain resumed. Proof of operational control, documented on video from 2 angles. I didn't shut it off permanently. I demonstrated capacity. That night, the trail camera activated again. The landscapers returned briefly, walking the tree perimeter with flashlights. One crouched near a trunk, inspecting the bark. They did not inject further. They left after 12 minutes. By 10 p.m., I received an email from the HOA president. "Removal crew confirmed for 8 a.m. tomorrow. Please ensure access." They believed the trees were already compromised beyond recovery. What they didn't know was that at 7:15 a.m., a State Water Authority inspector was scheduled to arrive after reviewing the contamination submission. Friday morning came fast. At 7:40 a.m., the removal truck idled outside the fence. Workers began unloading chainsaws and safety helmets. At 7:46 a.m., a white government-marked vehicle pulled into the Greenbelt service lane. The inspector stepped out holding a clipboard and a copy of the easement map. The landscapers paused. The HOA board president arrived minutes later, walking briskly across the grass toward my property line. 2 trucks, 2 authorities. one canal flowing quietly between them. If the inspector issued an immediate hold order, removal would stop. If he didn't, the chainsaws were already warming up, and the trees were only hours away from being cut. So the question became, would documentation outweigh momentum before steel met wood?
The chainsaws were running, but they never touched the bark. At 7:52 a.m., the State Water Authority inspector walked directly to the base of the first oak. He didn't speak at first. He crouched. He ran a gloved finger along one of the drilled injection points and held it up to the light. Then he photographed it, close range, multiple angles. One of the landscapers stepped forward and said they were authorized by the HOA to proceed with removal due to vegetative failure. The inspector asked a single question. Who authorized chemical application within a recorded agricultural irrigation easement? Silence. The HOA president attempted to redirect, explaining that the trees were dying and posed a safety risk. She gestured toward the yellowing canopy. The inspector stood up and pointed toward the canal. Does this channel supply the subdivision's irrigation and pond? Yes, she said cautiously. He nodded and pulled out a laminated copy of the easement map I had submitted the day before. This corridor falls under regulated water infrastructure. Any chemical introduction affecting adjacent vegetation requires notification and review. He then walked toward the canal intake grate and removed it carefully. He leaned down, examining sediment buildup along the edges. He scraped a sample into a sterile container. Visual, physical, measurable. The landscapers stepped back from the trees. The inspector placed a temporary hold notice on the trunk, bright white paper stapled beneath the HOA's orange removal tag. 2 notices, one over the other. He turned to the removal crew. No cutting until investigation concludes. The chainsaws powered down. The HOA president was stunned. But the escalation wasn't over. Around 9:30 a.m., 2 additional vehicles arrived, one from the irrigation district and one from the HOA's landscaping vendor's regional office. The scene became structured, procedural, and very visible to residents walking through the greenbelt. The irrigation district representative inspected the irrigation district canal flow gate on my property. I unlocked the small access panel and allowed him to examine the valve assembly. He photographed the serial plate and verified operational movement. Then he walked downstream and confirmed the linkage to the HOA pond. The Water Authority inspector opened the lab report binder I handed him and cross-referenced the chemical compound listed with state vegetation control guidelines. This compound is not approved for use within regulated irrigation easements without containment barriers, he said. Containment barriers did not exist. Meanwhile, one of the landscapers attempted to remove the green injection caps from the tree trunks quietly. The inspector noticed immediately. Leave them intact, he instructed. He photographed each cap and logged their placement pattern, evenly spaced, mechanical precision, not natural disease treatment. By midday, residents had gathered along the greenbelt walkway, whispering as officials moved between the canal and my property line. Then something happened the HOA did not anticipate. The irrigation district representative requested operational demonstration of flow control. I walked to the valve and with his supervision, rotated it halfway closed. Within minutes, the pond fountain pressure dropped. Sprinkler heads along the eastern lawn failed to extend fully. He documented the response time and wrote notes on his clipboard. Then I reopened it. Flow restored. The demonstration established something critical. The trees were not isolated landscaping. They stood within a regulated infrastructure corridor, actively supplying community irrigation. Any contamination wasn't confined to my yard. It potentially affected the entire shared water system. At 1:15 p.m., the inspector issued a formal temporary environmental review order,
posted visibly at the service gate and on my fence. Pending investigation of unauthorized chemical introduction within irrigation easement corridor. The removal crew packed up equipment. The HOA president attempted to argue procedural authority under association bylaws. The inspector responded calmly, "Association bylaws do not supersede recorded easement protections." That sentence shifted everything. By late afternoon, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting in the clubhouse overlooking the pond. Through the glass windows, I could see animated gestures and documents spread across the table. Outside, the fountain resumed steady pressure under full canal flow. The trees, though stressed, still stood, but the visual damage remained: yellowing leaves, drilled trunks, visible injection caps. The investigation would take days. The fines against me were still technically active, and the HOA had not yet acknowledged responsibility. That evening, I performed one more visual action. I hired an independent certified arborist, not to write a letter, but to conduct a live canopy assessment using a drone-mounted camera. We launched it from my yard and filmed the upper crown structure from above. The footage revealed asymmetrical chemical burn patterns radiating outward from injection sites. Not root disease, not fungal spread, direct trunk introduction. We captured it in high resolution. By sunset, the environmental hold order remained in place, but holds can be lifted, investigations can stall, and HOA boards often regroup quietly. The question now wasn't whether removal would happen, it was whether liability would be acknowledged before insurance and regulators stepped fully in. Because once that happened, this wouldn't just be about trees, it would be about jurisdiction, and the HOA had just crossed into territory they didn't control. So the real question became, would they admit error or double down before the investigation concluded?
By Monday morning, the trees were still standing, but the HOA had changed tactics. Instead of chainsaws, they sent an email to every homeowner in the subdivision titled "Temporary Irrigation Disruption, Private Property Issue." They were reframing the situation, implying that I had interfered with water flow and caused sprinkler inconsistencies. Within an hour, I walked back to the canal with a camera. The water was flowing normally. I filmed the depth marker I had installed days earlier, exactly 14 inches. I recorded the pond fountain spraying steadily. I captured 3 sprinkler heads rotating at full pressure. Then I did something deliberate. I mounted a transparent ruler permanently to the inside wall of the canal and secured it with stainless steel anchors, fully visible from above. From that moment forward, flow depth would be publicly measurable. If anyone claimed disruption, there would be visual proof. At 11:30 a.m., a certified letter arrived from the HOA's legal counsel demanding restoration of uninterrupted irrigation access and warning that any interference could result in enforcement action. I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to the irrigation district office and requested an official on-site flow verification. That afternoon, 2 district technicians arrived with calibrated flow meters. They lowered digital probes into the canal upstream and downstream of my property line. Numbers were recorded on video. Flow rate, consistent. Pressure, stable. No obstruction present. The technicians placed a small tamper-evident seal on the valve housing, documenting that no unauthorized adjustment had occurred since inspection. Visual, physical, verifiable. Meanwhile, the environmental review was progressing. A state environmental compliance officer returned with lab comparison results from the water samples I submitted. The upstream canal sample showed no contamination. The downstream sample, collected after passing my trees, contained trace residues of the same growth inhibitor compound found in the wood cores. The concentration was low, diluted, but detectable. The implication was clear. Chemical introduction had occurred within the easement corridor. At 3 p.m., the inspector photographed sediment beneath the pond intake grate and collected additional samples. The HOA president arrived again, this time accompanied by their landscaping contractor's regional manager. They attempted to explain the injections as preventative nutrient stabilization.
The inspector asked for the chemical application log. None was produced. Then he requested proof of notification to the water authority prior to application. None existed. Escalation shifted from debate to documentation.
By early evening, a formal notice of regulatory review was posted at the HOA clubhouse entrance, visible to every resident entering the greenbelt. It stated that potential unauthorized chemical introduction within a regulated irrigation easement was under investigation. The narrative had changed. It was no longer homeowner refuses removal. It was association actions under environmental review. The next day brought the turning point. The HOA's insurance adjuster arrived, not for a meeting, but for visual inspection. He walked the tree perimeter with a tablet, photographing drill patterns. He examined the injection cap still embedded in bark. He reviewed the arborist drone footage on my device. Then he asked to see the easement documents. I laid the certified 1926 map across the hood of his vehicle. He studied the boundary lines carefully. If this easement grants operational control to the landowner, and if chemical application occurred without regulatory clearance, liability is significant, he said slowly. He requested a copy of the environmental lab confirmation. I handed it over. While he reviewed it, a gust of wind shook the canopy overhead. A cluster of brittle leaves fell between us, visible damage undeniable. He looked up at the trees. These were viable prior to injection? Yes, I replied. Photographic canopy records from 3 weeks ago. I showed him the time-stamped footage. He nodded once. By late afternoon, the HOA board called an emergency closed session. No public announcements, no emails, but visible action told the story. The landscaping company removed their equipment from the service lane entirely. The pre-removal signage disappeared from my fence. The orange spray-painted X's were scrubbed from the bark, though faint outlines remained. At sunset, the HOA president approached my gate. Her tone was measured. The board is reviewing options. I didn't respond emotionally. I simply handed her a printed copy of the irrigation district's flow verification report and the environmental contamination summary. This investigation is still active, I said calmly. That night, something else happened. The State Water Authority issued a preliminary citation notice, not final but official, stating that unauthorized vegetation chemical introduction within a regulated easement corridor may constitute violations subject to penalty. The citation referenced the recorded easement number, it referenced the irrigation linkage, it referenced contamination confirmation, and it referenced the responsible party as association contracted vendor activity. By morning, the HOA's insurer requested a formal damage assessment estimate for tree remediation, soil detoxification, trunk treatment, canopy stabilization. For the first time since the drill holes appeared, removal was no longer on the table. Restoration was. But restoration is expensive, and citations escalate. The board now faced 3 pressures simultaneously: regulatory investigation, insurance liability review, documented operational easement control outside their authority. The trees still stood, weakened but alive. The pond fountain flowed. The canal ruler marked steady depth. The evidence was no longer private, it was institutional. The question now wasn't whether they would settle, it was how much exposure they were willing to risk before regulators converted a preliminary citation into a formal enforcement action. Because once that happened, this would move beyond insurance and into state penalty territory. So the final question became, would the HOA resolve it quietly or force the investigation to its conclusion? By Thursday morning, the board stopped sending warnings. Instead, they requested a resolution meeting. No violation letters, no removal notices, just one sentence: we would like to discuss restoration. But before that meeting happened, the State Water Authority finalized its findings. The conclusion was precise. Chemical growth inhibitor confirmed in tree tissue. Trace compound detected in downstream irrigation flow. No permit filed for application within a regulated easement corridor.
No notification submitted to the irrigation district. The preliminary citation became formal. A regulatory violation number was issued, and because the trees stood inside a recorded agricultural irrigation easement with operational control retained by the landowner, jurisdiction was clear. That afternoon, two officials returned to conduct final photographic documentation. They placed bright yellow regulatory markers at the base of each oak, not removal tags, but protected vegetation under environmental review placards. Residents walking the greenbelt slowed down to read them. The visual had completely flipped. The same trees that had been labeled hazards were now officially protected, pending restoration.
At 3 p.m., the HOA board, their legal counsel, and their insurance adjuster sat across from me in the clubhouse conference room overlooking the pond. Through the window, the fountain sprayed steadily, powered by the canal that crossed my land. The adjuster opened first. Our assessment indicates liability exposure through unauthorized vendor action. He slid a document across the table, a proposed settlement framework. Full remediation of soil and trunk tissue under certified arborist supervision, long-term canopy recovery monitoring funded for 5 years, reversal of all fines issued, written acknowledgement that removal authorization is void, insurance-covered restoration costs. But there was one more element. The State Water Authority representative, present as observer, added a final condition. Future chemical applications within the subdivision's irrigation zone would require direct regulatory notification. The HOA would no longer operate independently in that corridor. The board president signed the settlement draft. 2 days later, her resignation letter was circulated to residents. No public accusation, no dramatic speech, just stepping down due to regulatory compliance concerns. The landscaping contractor's state license entered temporary review status. The irrigation district installed a permanent monitoring plate at the canal junction, visually marking the easement boundary for the first time since the 1920s.
And then came the final physical moment. Under supervision of a certified arborist, remediation began. Workers carefully removed the remaining injection caps from the trunks. They flushed each drill cavity with neutralizing solution. They aerated the soil using vertical mulching equipment to restore oxygen flow to the roots. Weeks later, small signs of recovery appeared. New leaf buds, faint but visible, formed along secondary branches. The canopy began regaining density. I documented every stage, not for confrontation, for record. 1 month after the settlement, the State Water Authority issued its closing notice. Citation resolved under corrective action, no further enforcement required. The HOA's insurance carrier paid the restoration costs in full. All fines were formally voided, and the irrigation easement, once forgotten, was added to the subdivision's official infrastructure map. One evening near sunset, I stood by the canal and looked at the ruler mounted inside its wall. Flow depth, 14 inches, steady, uninterrupted. The fountain in the pond caught the light and scattered it across the water. The trees behind me rustled, not brittle now, but resilient. The HOA believed they were eliminating a landscaping issue. They didn't realize they were operating inside a regulated water corridor older than their governing documents. They thought removal authority was enough. They didn't check the deed. They didn't verify jurisdiction. They didn't expect documentation to outpace momentum. In the end, nothing dramatic was shouted. No gates were locked, no equipment was seized. Just maps, lab reports, flow measurements, and a 1926 easement recorded long before the HOA existed. The trees survived, the fines disappeared, the citation was issued, and the water kept flowing, exactly where it was always legally allowed to flow. The only real question left is this: if they had checked the easement first, would they have ever touched the trees at all?